Story 1. The basement that should have stayed locked. Katie's old Toyota rolled up to the house just as the sun began to set over the Denver suburbs. The place wasn't enormous, but it was definitely a step up from her tiny apartment downtown. It was the kind of suburban home you see in real estate ads, boasting a wraparound porch, 2 stories, and a perfectly manicured lawn. The family she was house-sitting for, the Kerrigans, were family friends, and she jumped at the chance to make some extra cash while they vacationed for the weekend. Walking through the front door, she was greeted by Baxter, their golden retriever, wagging his tail furiously. The Kerrigans had left a note on the kitchen counter. "Katie, thanks again for watching the house and Baxter. Feel free to use the guest room and help yourself to anything in the fridge. Just one thing. The basement door stays locked. Don't worry about it. See you Monday." The Kerrigans. Katie shrugged, tossing her keys on the counter. The basement door stays locked. Weird, she thought. But she didn't think much of it at the time. The house was comfortable, and Baxter's company was enough to keep her entertained. She fed the dog, grabbed some leftovers from the fridge, and settled into the guest room with a movie. That night, the house was eerily quiet. Baxter snored softly at the foot of the bed, while Katie scrolled through her phone, fighting sleep. Then, at around 2 a.m., she heard it, a faint scratching sound. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was distant, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the house. At first, she thought it was just the wind rattling the windows, but then it grew louder, more insistent, like someone or something was clawing at wood. She tiptoed down the hall, her bare feet making no sound against the wooden floors. The house was dark, except for a soft glow from the kitchen light. As she got closer to the stairs leading down to the basement, the noise became clearer. It was definitely coming from behind the basement door. Katie stopped at the door, her breath shallow. The scratching stopped as soon as she approached. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the door, unsure of what to do. Should she open it? The Kerrigans had specifically said to leave it alone, but why? What was behind the door? She pressed her ear against the cold wood, listening. Silence. She shook her head, stepping back. "You're just being paranoid," she whispered to herself. Katie returned to the guest room, pulling the blankets up over her head. It was nothing, just the house settling. Old houses made noise, right? But deep down, she wasn't convinced. The next day, everything felt normal again. Katie took Baxter for a walk around the neighborhood, waving to friendly neighbors who were mowing their lawns or chatting on their porches. The sun was shining, and the unease from the night before seemed to have evaporated. She was even starting to think she had imagined the whole thing. But as night fell, the scratching returned. This time, it started earlier, just after midnight. The soft, insistent sound of claws or nails against wood. Katie sat up in bed, her stomach twisting into knots. Baxter was wide awake too, ears perked up and staring at the bedroom door. It wasn't her imagination. Something was definitely in the basement. Her phone screen lit up as she dialed Mrs. Kerrigan's number. No answer. She tried Mr. Kerrigan. Same result. "Are you kidding me?" she muttered, tossing the phone onto the bed. She didn't want to be that person who freaks out over nothing, but her instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. Katie grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, her hand shaking as she approached the basement door again. The scratching had stopped, just like it had the night before, but this time she wasn't going to ignore it. She needed to know what was behind that door. She turned the flashlight on, the beam of light casting long shadows against the walls. The door itself looked unremarkable, just an old, wooden door with a brass handle. But the lock was heavy-duty, newer than the rest of the house, and clearly meant to keep something or someone out. She stood there for a long time, her hand hovering over the handle. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind this door wasn't supposed to be let out. But the curiosity was killing her. Slowly, she reached for the handle and gave it a gentle twist. It didn't budge. Locked, just like they said. Katie exhaled, her pulse slowing. Maybe that was a good thing. Maybe it was better that it stayed locked. But just as she was about to turn away, something thudded hard against the other side of the door. She jumped back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, the beam flickering wildly. Baxter began barking, his fur standing on end as he bolted toward the basement door, growling viciously at whatever was behind it. Katie grabbed the flashlight and backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her throat. The door rattled in its frame, but the lock held firm. The next morning, Katie didn't waste any time. She called the Kerrigans again, but there was still no answer. She left frantic voicemails. "Something's in the basement. Please call me back." For the rest of the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in the house. Every creak and groan of the old wood seemed louder, more deliberate. She found herself glancing at the basement door constantly, waiting for it to move again. Baxter was on edge too, pacing the house and growling at nothing. That night, Katie could barely sleep. She left the TV on, trying to drown out the silence. Around 3 a.m., the scratching returned, louder than ever before. It was relentless now, as if whatever was behind that door was desperate to get out. She sat up in bed, her body rigid with fear. "I can't stay here," she whispered to herself. She grabbed her phone and started to pack her things. But just as she reached for her keys, her phone buzzed. A message from Mrs. Lau. Kerrigan finally came through. It read, "We're so sorry about the basement. Whatever you do, don't try to open the door. We should have told you, but it's not safe. Just leave it alone, and we'll explain when we get back." Katie stared at the message in disbelief. Not safe? What did that mean? Her eyes darted to the basement door, where the scratching had now turned into furious banging. Whatever was in there wasn't going to stay quiet for much longer. Without hesitation, she grabbed Baxter and bolted for the front door, slamming it behind her. She drove away as fast as she could, not stopping until she was far from the house. Whatever was in that basement, she didn't want to find out. When the Kerrigans finally returned, they found the basement door scratched and dented. But when they opened it, they found nothing inside, nothing but dust and shadows. Story 2. The Stranger in the Window. Tyler needed the cash. College wasn't cheap, and house-sitting seemed like an easy way to make some extra money. When his professor, Dr. Hutchins, asked if he'd be willing to take care of his remote cabin in the Maine woods for 2 weeks, Tyler agreed immediately. All he had to do was feed the cat, water some plants, and keep an eye on the place. Plus, the isolation sounded like the perfect break from noisy roommates and endless assignments. The cabin was a picture-perfect getaway, surrounded by towering pine trees with a lake just a short walk away. It was the kind of place where people went to unplug and recharge. As Tyler pulled up the gravel driveway, the crunch of his tires echoed through the dense woods. He parked and stepped out of the car, taking in the crisp, cool air. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the soft lapping of water from the lake. Total silence. Perfect. Inside, the cabin was just as cozy as it looked on the outside. A small, wood-burning stove in the corner, a plush couch facing a large window overlooking the woods, and shelves lined with books. Dr. Hutchins had left a note. "Tyler, thanks again for house-sitting. Make yourself at home. P.S. Don't worry if you hear weird noises at night. The wind can be loud out here." Tyler smirked. "Yeah, right, blame it on the wind," he muttered. He wasn't worried. The place was as peaceful as it got. After unpacking and feeding the cat, he settled on the couch with a blanket and flipped through the bookshelves. The quiet was almost unnerving. No city sounds, no cars, not even a distant hum of life. Just nothing. That night, Tyler started hearing the noises. At first, it was subtle. Branches tapping against the windows, the wind howling through the trees. But around midnight, he heard something else. Footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. His eyes darted to the window, where he saw nothing but the darkness of the woods. The footsteps seemed to come from outside, moving closer to the house. Tyler stood up slowly, peeking out the front window. That's when he saw it. A figure, just barely visible at the edge of the woods, standing still, staring at the cabin. Tyler's heart skipped a beat. The figure was too far away to see clearly, but there was no mistaking the shape of a person. He blinked, and just like that, the figure was gone. Tyler stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. His breath fogged up the glass as he tried to make sense of what he'd just seen. The figure had been there, a person, or at least something shaped like a person. But now, the woods were empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a shadow or a trick of the light. He'd been cooped up inside all day, and his mind was probably playing tricks on him. Still, the feeling of unease gnawed at him. He locked the doors, double-checking every window, and made sure the curtains were drawn before heading to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, the bright sunlight streaming through the windows calmed his nerves. The figure in the woods seemed like a distant memory, something he could almost laugh about now. He spent the day by the lake, reading and listening to music. The isolation was starting to grow on him. No deadlines, no stress, just the sound of nature. But as the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, the unease returned. The cabin felt too quiet, too still. As he ate dinner, Tyler caught himself glancing toward the large window every few minutes, half expecting to see someone standing there again. Around 11 p.m., it happened. Tyler was lying on the couch, staring blankly at his phone, when a movement outside caught his eye. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. The figure was back. Closer this time. It stood just outside the tree line, watching the house. Tyler's heart raced. He squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure remained nothing more than a silhouette. He scrambled off the couch, flicking on the porch light. The sudden burst of light made him squint, and for a moment, he lost sight of the figure. When his eyes adjusted, the figure was gone. Again, Tyler's chest tightened. This wasn't normal. He locked the front door, pulling the heavy wooden blinds over the window. His pulse thudded in his ears. Was it someone messing with him? Maybe a neighbor playing a prank? But why? He didn't know anyone out here, and the nearest house was miles away. For the rest of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was outside, lurking just beyond the trees. The cat seemed to sense it too, pacing the cabin and staring at the door, her fur on edge. Tyler barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the shadowy figure. The next day, Tyler was exhausted. He couldn't focus, constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for something to happen. The figure had been there 2 nights in a row. What if they came back again? He debated calling Dr. Hutchins, but what would he say? "Hey, I think there's a creepy person watching your house." It sounded ridiculous. By the time night fell, Tyler's anxiety was through the roof. He kept all the lights on, refusing to look out the windows. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards made him jump. And then, just like clockwork, the footsteps returned. He heard them outside, moving slowly around the cabin. Tyler's blood ran cold. His phone trembled in his hand as he dialed 911, but before the operator could answer, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a loud knock at the window. Tyler froze. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a slow scrape against the glass. His throat tightened as he turned toward the living room window. Through a small gap in the blinds, he could see the outline of a hand, just a hand, pressed against the glass. He didn't stay to see the rest. Grabbing his keys and the cat, Tyler bolted for the back door, his heart racing in his chest. He barely managed to unlock his car with shaking hands, throwing himself inside and speeding down the gravel driveway. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the figure again, standing by the cabin, watching him drive away. Tyler didn't stop until he reached the nearest town, where he spent the rest of the night in a hotel. The police arrived at the cabin the next morning, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no handprints on the glass, nothing. He never went back to finish the job. Tyler left the keys at the local police station and sent Dr. Hutchins a short, simple text. "I'm done. There's something wrong with your cabin." Weeks later, Tyler heard from a mutual friend that Dr. Hutchins had sold the cabin. When asked why, the professor simply said, it wasn't safe anymore. Tyler didn't ask any more questions. He didn't need to. Story 3. The Voices in the Attic. Sarah had always been there for Amanda. Best friends since grade school, they'd shared everything, from teenage secrets to adult struggles. So when Amanda asked Sarah to house sit while she and her husband went on a week-long vacation, it wasn't a tough decision. Amanda's house was a charming, 2-story home in rural Pennsylvania, nestled far from the nearest town. It would be a peaceful escape, Sarah thought. Just her, Amanda's golden retriever, Milo, and a week to relax. She arrived late in the afternoon, welcomed by Milo's excited barking. The house felt warm and inviting, with its rustic wooden beams and soft lighting. Amanda had left detailed instructions. Feed Milo twice a day, water the plants, and whatever you do, don't worry about the attic. The door is locked, and there's no reason to go up there. Thanks again. The note ended with a smiley face, but that last part about the attic struck Sarah as a bit odd. She shrugged it off. Everyone had their quirks, right? Maybe it was just a storage space full of old junk, or maybe Amanda and her husband didn't want her stumbling upon anything personal. Either way, Sarah didn't intend to snoop. After feeding Milo and getting settled, she curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, enjoying the silence of the countryside. It was refreshing, being away from the constant hum of the city. But as the night wore on, that silence started to feel heavy. The house creaked, as all old houses do, but it was more than that. At around midnight, as Sarah was drifting off to sleep, she heard something faint. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she strained to listen, the sound became clearer. It was whispering, muffled, almost inaudible, but unmistakably voices coming from above. Sarah's eyes shot open. She sat up in bed, heart racing. The sound seemed to be coming from the attic, the one Amanda had specifically told her not to worry about. It's probably nothing, she muttered to herself, trying to push down the rising fear. But the whispers continued, soft and eerie, filling the dark silence of the house. Unable to ignore it, Sarah grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. She tiptoed down the hallway, feeling her pulse thud in her ears. The attic door was at the end of the hallway, tucked between two guest rooms. It was closed, just as Amanda had said, and looked completely ordinary. But the whispers were clearer now, like they were right on the other side of the door. She stood there, frozen, her hand hovering over the handle. Should she open it? Should she call Amanda? She took a deep breath and knocked on the door, hoping to convince herself there was nothing to be afraid of. The whispers stopped. Sarah stood in front of the attic door, her hand trembling slightly as she withdrew it from the handle. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the whispers. She stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the house remained quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the heater kicking in. She tried to laugh it off, forcing herself to walk away. It's just the house settling. Old houses make noise all the time, she reassured herself. Back in bed, Milo curled up at her feet, and the rhythmic sound of his breathing eventually lulled her to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun streamed through the kitchen window as Sarah made coffee, and Milo followed her around the house, wagging his tail. She checked on the plants, took Milo for a walk, and spent the rest of the afternoon reading on the porch. The whispers from the night before felt like a distant memory, something her tired brain had conjured up. But that night, the whispers returned. It was around 2 a.m. when Sarah woke up again. This time, the voices were louder, clearer. She could almost make out words, though the language was foreign, unsettling. Her heart pounded as she listened, trying to convince herself it was just the wind. But deep down, she knew. These were voices that had no business being in an empty house. She grabbed her phone and texted Amanda. Hey, weird question, but is there any chance someone could be in the attic? I've been hearing strange noises. No reply. Sarah paced the room, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. The whispers were relentless, like a chorus of voices all murmuring at once. They seemed to grow louder, more urgent. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and headed back down the hallway, stopping once again in front of the attic door. Her phone buzzed in her hand, startling her. A message from Amanda had finally come through. Don't go in the attic. Whatever you do, stay away from it. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. The urgency in Amanda's message made her skin crawl. Why had she been so specific? What was up there? As Sarah stared at the attic door, she heard something new. Not just whispers this time, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth above her head. Sarah's entire body tensed as the footsteps above her grew louder, more distinct. Someone, or something, was in the attic, walking back and forth, just inches from where she stood. The wooden floor creaked under the weight, and the sound sent shivers down her spine. She gripped her phone tightly, her mind racing. Should she leave? Call the police? But the thought of walking outside in the pitch-black countryside with nothing but miles of forest surrounding her felt even more terrifying. She decided to text Amanda again. Amanda, I'm freaking out. I swear there's someone in the attic. What's going on? Her fingers hovered over the screen, waiting for a response. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Then slowly, she heard the unmistakable sound of the attic door creaking open. Her blood ran cold. Sarah hadn't moved. She was standing right in front of the door, but she hadn't touched it. It was opening on its own. The door swung inward, revealing the dark staircase that led up into the attic. The air grew thick and musty, and Sarah felt a rush of cold air blow down from above. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she was frozen in place, unable to tear her eyes away from the darkness beyond the door. Then, her phone buzzed again. A new message from Amanda. Whatever you do not let it out. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Let what out? She backed away from the door, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Something moved in the shadows at the top of the stairs. A shape, barely visible, shifted in the darkness. Milo began growling low in his throat, backing away from the hallway. Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She couldn't stay in the house, not with whatever was up there. She grabbed Milo's leash and bolted for the front door, yanking it open with trembling hands. As she ran out into the cold night air, she glanced back just in time to see the attic door slam shut behind her. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, Milo barking wildly beside her. She sped down the country road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had no idea what was in that attic, and she didn't want to find out. The next morning, Sarah called Amanda again, desperate for answers. This time, Amanda picked up. Her voice was shaky, filled with guilt. I should have told you, she said. We've had incidents before. We thought it was harmless. Just voices, nothing more. But lately, it's been getting stronger. We didn't want to scare you. Sarah was stunned. What is it? What's in your attic? She demanded. Amanda paused, her voice barely above a whisper. We don't know. We found the house this way when we bought it. The previous owners warned us about the attic, but we didn't believe them. Whatever's up there, it's been locked away for years. Sarah didn't ask any more questions. She hung up the phone, her skin crawling at the thought of what she had heard. What she had almost let out. She didn't need to know the rest. She'd never set foot in that house again,